Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and in today's video, we will be exploring the poem Vergissmeinnicht. So, Vergissmeinnicht, what do we need to know about this poem? Well, let's start with the poet, Keith Douglas. Douglas was a Second World War tank commander. He fought in the Western Africa campaign, but he was sadly killed during the invasion of Normandy. Now, Douglas has described his poetry or his poetic style as extrospective, which he explained is focused on the external impressions rather than internal emotions. Now, between you and me, that just sounds like symbolism, but he calls it extrospective. So what do we need to do with that? Well, we need to look at the imagery, the impressions that he gives us in this poem, and we're going to need to read between the lines to work out exactly what his characters are feeling and what key ideas he wants us to infer. Now, this poem, Vergissmeinnicht, is a German word for forget-me-not. And this title is itself really interesting. There's a few different things we might say about it. On a simple level, forget-me-not is a sort of instruction, don't forget me. It's something that one lover might say to another, and that's going to become relevant in this poem. It's also a flower, a forget-me-not, which again, a very beautiful flower, a symbol of love. It's interesting that he's chosen this symbol which has got something to do with love in this poem, which, as we're going to see, is going to be about war. So that suggests that love is going to be one of the key themes of this poem. But as this poem appears in the conflict cluster of the poetry anthology, you might be wondering what types of conflicts to look out for. So there's a few types. On a simple level, there is physical conflict. There is a war, we're going to see people killed, and it's going to explore the reality of warfare and physical conflict. But there's a lot of emotional conflict too, not in an overt way. That's not Douglas's style, but if we read between the lines, we'll see there's a lot of emotional conflict, and we're going to have to work out how the narrator feels about war. How does he feel about the people that he has killed, and how does he feel about their loved ones, the family and friends of the people that he has killed? And that really ties into one of the key questions in this poem. What is the cost of conflict? Is warfare something which is justifiable? Let's have a look at the poem together, and then you can let me know in the comments what you think. So here is the poem. Let's read it together. Vergissmeinnicht. 3 weeks gone, and the combatants gone, returning over the nightmare ground. We found the place again, and found the soldier sprawling in the sun, the frowning barrel of his gun overshadowing. As we came on that day, he hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon. Look, here in the gun pit spoil, the dishonoured picture of his girl who has put Steffi, Vergissmeinnicht, in a copybook Gothic script. We see him almost with content, abased, seeming to have paid and mocked at by his own equipment that's hard and good when he's decayed. But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, had done the lover mortal hurt. Okay, so if you've just read that and that was the first time you've seen the poem and you're not entirely sure what's going on, don't be put off. Poetry is something we need to look at again and we need to ask questions about. So let's do that together, and let's just start with some really simple ones, like what do certain words mean? Because there might be some words you're not familiar with. So let me just pick out a few that you might be unfamiliar with. Let's start off with the word swart. My students often ask about swart, so swart flies. So swart just means sort of dark coloured. So here we've got an image of dark coloured flies flying onto a dead body. What are some other words that people might struggle with? Gun pit spoil, just a reference to a place on the battlefield where they are. Well, on a battlefield, maybe they're in a crater where a gun was based to shoot at the opponent. Are there any other words that I think we might find difficult? If there are, do let me know in the comment and I can respond. But for now, let's dive into the poem and have a look at some of the key things going on. So, this poem is really, really interesting because we have the narrator of this poem is a soldier who's gone into battle and he's come back from the battle and he's returned to the battlefield 3 weeks later. And the combatants, the people he was fighting against, have gone. The ground that he was fighting on was nightmarish 3 weeks ago. And having found the place again, they find a soldier sprawling in the sun. Now, when we read that for the very first time, we might imagine a living soldier who is there waiting for them. But as the rest of the poem is going to make quite clear, this soldier is someone who has died, who was killed, most likely by the narrator himself 3 weeks earlier. So that leads me to the first comment I want to make about this poem, this imagery of the dead soldier sprawling in the sun. This imagery is very sinister for a few reasons. The verb sprawling is normally a word which has really positive connotations. You might think about sprawling out on a sunbed, for example, getting a nice tan. But that's not what's going on here. That word, sprawling, is being used to describe a dead body. And that contrast between the usually positive connotation to sprawling and the fact that it's being applied to a dead body, it creates a really uncomfortable sensation for the reader. That discomfort, I would argue, is emphasised by the use of alliteration, the repetition of the S sound, soldier sprawling in the sun. Or if you'd rather say sibilants rather than alliteration, that's fine too. Soldier sprawling in the sun. It's quite an aggressive, quite a frustrating sound that comes from that alliteration, and that aggressive, frustrating sound reinforces just how uncomfortable this image of finding a dead soldier on the battlefield is for the narrator. Now I'm going to skip over the frowning barrel of his gun. I'll come back to that later, but here I want to focus on that we have a gun which is overshadowing. And here we have the technique of enjambment being used. So enjambment is when a line has a line break in the middle of it. So I'd like to imagine that instead of saying the frowning barrel of his gun overshadowing, imagine the overshadowing appearing where I put the orange line. Here overshadowing has dropped down and it now appears over here, the line below. This line break draws our attention to the words gun and overshadowing in a way that it might not do if there was no enjambment. So we can ask ourselves, okay, why might Douglas want to draw our attention to the soldier's gun, which is overshadowing? Well, first of all, the focus on the gun just reminds us what a hostile environment is going on in this poem. But furthermore, the fact that the gun is overshadowing, it's looming, it's got a really big, strong presence on the battlefield. It's just a reminder that this is a violent, terrifying environment. There's also another thing that you can say about this, but I'm going to come back to that later when I talk about the use of extended personification in weaponry in this poem. For now, I want to talk about the fact that the enemy soldier 3 weeks earlier had attacked the narrator. He'd hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon. We continue to have violence referred to, the violent verb hit being used, and we have this simile like the entry of a demon, which really dehumanizes the enemy soldier. He was demonic, he was threatening, he was really, really terrifying. It's very different from what it's like 3 weeks later, because 3 weeks earlier he'd been really, really violent and terrifying, but now he's sprawling in the sun, dead. And so even though I haven't put this on my PowerPoint, I'll just draw a little line. The contrast between him being demonic and hitting the tank in a really violent way, and him now sprawling in the sun, it just exaggerates just how much has been lost from the enemy soldier. his strength has gone, his life has gone. It highlights just how destructive war really is. We then come to this really interesting stanza in the middle of the poem, where the narrator doesn't focus on the dead soldier that he finds on the battlefield. He focuses on a picture that he finds next to the soldier. And it's a picture of the girl, that's the word the poem uses, the girl of the dead soldier. So I tend to interpret that as either a lover, a girlfriend, maybe a wife, it's unclear. But the narrator finds this photograph or this drawing of the soldier's lover, this girl, who is written on the back, her name, which is Steffi, and then it says Vergissmeinnicht, which as we know means forget me not, don't forget me. And it's really interesting how in this stanza the poet really lingers on this image. There's a really sharp contrast between this quite intimate image in stanza 3 and the violence we see in stanza 2. I would suggest that contrast makes the violence of stanza 2 all the more shocking, and it makes the intimacy of stanza 3 all the more powerful. We are really forced to reflect on the fact that this soldier, who had been attacking the narrator 3 weeks ago, who was killed by the narrator 3 weeks ago, had someone at home who loved him, who said, "Don't forget me." And I would suggest that creates a lot of sorrow. It's quite a sad effect on the reader, and it draws our attention to the fact that the victims of war aren't just the physical combatants on the battlefield. It's not just the soldiers, it's the people back home too. I want to talk about the adjective dishonoured here, because this is really ambiguous, which is just a fancy way of saying unclear. It's a really unclear adjective. Why is the picture of this girl dishonoured? Is the picture of this girl dishonoured because it was given to an enemy soldier? Is it dishonoured because it's now left next to a dead body? It's really unclear, and you can maybe suggest in the comments why you think dishonoured has been used like this. For me, I would suggest that the fact that this image of love is left next to a dead body, that's what the dishonour is. There's a sense of discomfort. We've got an image of love and an image of death put side by side together. It's uncomfortable, and an uncomfortable reminder for us that war has very tragic and devastating consequences. And just to reinforce that idea, we have this contrast of love and violence appearing within stanza 3 itself. I mean, the picture is found in a gun pit spoil, and yet we've got Steffi saying, "Don't forget me," in this place of violence and death. Now, here we come back to the narrator. The narrator who, remember, is standing in this gun pit looking down at the dead body of a soldier that he killed 3 weeks earlier. And it says that we see him almost with content. He's been abased, which means sort of mocked. And he's paid and mocked at by his own equipment. Some of my students often ask me why the word paid is used here. I think the word paid is being used in the sense of, oh, well, he's paid for what he did, in a sort of kind of cruel revenge way. Like, he's paid what he owed. A bit like the idea of karma. So because the enemy soldier attacked the narrator, well, he paid for that with his life by being killed. It's quite a cruel and quite a sinister idea here. And I would suggest that the tone of the narrator is quite callous. That the narrator is able to talk in almost a pleased way about the fact that he sees a dead body on the floor. I would suggest that this shows that war has dehumanized the narrator, because the narrator is not showing much empathy here. That empathy, the ability to feel sympathy and remorse for other people, has been lost by the narrator, and we can see this through his callous tone. Alternatively, you could argue that this just reflects the fact that in warfare, soldiers do have to do some quite violent things. It's the uncomfortable truth of war. Soldiers do fight and soldiers do kill. This just could show that the soldier's been desensitized to violence rather than dehumanized. Let me know what you think. And now I want to come to what I would argue is one of the kind of key features of this poem, which is the use of extended personification. So personification, as I'm sure you know, is when something that is non-human is given human characteristics. So on a really simple level, if I was to say that the tree danced or the tree waved in the wind, I'm giving the tree, something non-human, the human-like characteristics of waving or dancing. Now we see tons of this in this poem. So in this stanza, we see the dead soldier's equipment is mocking him. It's mocking him, so that's personification. And if we go back to frowning barrel of his gun in stanza 2, here again we see the weaponry, the gun, is frowning, another human-like characteristic. Now what's really interesting here is in this poem, what seems more human? The dead soldier or the weapons? I would suggest in this poem, actually, the inanimate weapons seem more human than the dead soldier. You know, the gun is frowning, the equipment is mocking, whereas by contrast, the dead soldier has decayed. He's just left there sprawling in the sun. So I would suggest that the contrast between the weapons, who are given kind of human-like characteristics in this poem, and the dead soldier, who is dehumanized in this poem, overall it just shows how dehumanizing war is. That weaponry seems more human than the combatants themselves. They've had their humanity taken away from them by being killed in war. And now we come back to Steffi. Steffi, who would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. Now, there's no getting away from this. The imagery in this stanza is incredibly violent. So we have lots of flies moving on the dead soldier's skin, which is uncomfortable. And I haven't written this, but as I just say it, I'm drawn to the alliteration on his skin. The swart flies move. There's an S at the end of flies. And again, it's an uncomfortable, sinister tone that emerges from that sibilance or that alliteration. And that mirrors just how uncomfortable this image is of really zooming in and focusing on these flies on this dead body. It really shows how just awful war is. So too does the burst stomach like a cave. That simile almost makes us imagine a hole in the soldier's chest, and it's large and it's endless like a cave, showing us how violent and destructive war can be. There's even a suggestion that the soldier's skin has got dust on it, which is a reference to the fact that it's been left there for a long time. But also the eye looks paper-like. Maybe it's wrinkly, maybe it's crumply. But paper's quite fragile. And I think it just shows how fragile humanity is in war, that it can be destroyed so easily, that stomachs can be burst like a cave, and bodies can be left on the ground for 3 weeks for the swart flies to move in. Now this violent imagery is once again contrasted with Steffi weeping, and I would suggest that this contrast makes the violence seem all the worse, because it's making Steffi back home really upset to even imagine this. And equally, the contrast between the violence and Steffi makes Steffi's emotional grief seem all the more powerful, because we can see the cause of it. It just shows how devastating war can be for so many people. And then we come to the final stanza. Now, if you find this final stanza difficult, I think it is tricky. I think the poet uses ambiguous or unclear language. Let's puzzle through it a bit together. For here, the lover and killer are mingled. Now that's really interesting. What is being referred to here? Here, the lover and killer are mingled. Is the dead soldier being referred to here? Someone who was a killer, as we saw earlier in the poem. You know, this person tried to attack the narrator, hit my tank like the entry of a demon, but also was a lover because they were in love with Steffi. Or is it maybe a reference to the narrator himself? You know, I'm also a killer. Clearly, he's killed the soldier on the ground, but presumably there are people that he loves as well. I think this imagery shows the duality of humanity, the fact that people are complicated and have different sides to them. How a soldier can commit horrendous acts of violence but still go home and show love and compassion to their friends and to their family. So for here, the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, had done the lover mortal hurt. And so we've got death singled out this dead soldier, and it's done the lover mortal hurt. And the question here is, who is the lover? Is the lover Steffi? Steffi has been hurt by the soldier's death. That would make sense. It would suggest that war has consequences not just for the direct combatants, but for all people who are linked to the war, including friends and family. Is it the soldier himself? The soldier was a lover, and death singling him out has hurt him and meant there's less love in the world. Could it even be a reference to the narrator? I'm less persuaded by that third one, but it's still a question worth considering. So I hope that's been a useful exploration of Vergissmeinnicht. It's a complex poem, but for me, I would draw attention to 3 key messages. Firstly, I think this poem shows that war is dehumanizing. It makes the people involved in war seem less human. And I think it does that in a few ways. I think, as I've mentioned, the narrator seems to lack empathy in this poem. They're able to talk about the dead soldier in quite a callous way, seeing him with content, abased, seeming to have paid. But also, we see that a victim of war is treated with disrespect. We saw that the weapons of war were given more of a personality than the dead soldier. It's interesting that the dead soldier is never named in this poem. That name would give him more of a personality. It would make us think more about his humanity. But he's just a nameless dead soldier in this poem who's compared to a demon at one point. But also, people like Steffi, other victims of war, are treated with disrespect. There's a suggestion that having her photo next to a dead body dishonours her. And so war dehumanises everyone involved, the narrator, the victim, the direct victim, the soldier, and the related victims, people like Steffi. They all seem to lose something through their involvement with war. And through this, I would argue that the poem explores just how horrific war is. War does not come out as a good thing in this poem. If you think about other poems like The Destruction of Sennacherib, for example, which is also in your poetry anthology, in that poem, there seems to be a suggestion that through that military conflict and through God's intervention, almost a righteous outcome occurs. God intervenes and protects his people from the evil Assyrian army. That's very different to what's going on here. War does not seem to be justifiable in any way in this poem. It just comes across as horrific, brutal, and destructive. And I'm going to end this analysis here. I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And until next time. Cheerio.